metaverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and this is kind of like a reply video, but in actual reality, it's more like a holy crap, that video was so awesome and I want to talk about it with you guys type of video, because I'm talking about a video that was recently put up by Todd on Todd's Workshop. Now, if you don't know who Todd is, I actually have given him a shout out on this channel before because he makes some really awesome stuff. He has so much experience in actually building historically accurate medieval weapons, and he goes into some obscure, strange weapons and then the more common type swords, daggers and such, and has also made some really obscure things. He has helped out TV shows, produce props and things, has been in competitions, and has been making some of the best YouTube content you will find anywhere. And I mean that seriously, he makes real stuff and then he shares it with you, what it looks like and the historical context where it comes from. More recently, his production values has just shot up and his videos have been incredible and been getting the appropriate amount of attention, but I'm not sure if this more recent one is going to get the attention it truly deserves, because this most recent video where he basically makes the most scientifically valid test between a longbow and medieval armor. So I'm gonna explore that far more, but some of the other videos he's made of exceptional high quality was looking at medieval arrowheads, sword breakers, and there's so much more. The information he shares on medieval daggers, and I love some of his obscure ones. One of the videos I've shouted out was the videos he made on the medieval war dart and the slings as well. This is just glorious content. So if you haven't subscribed and you have any interest at all in medieval weapons and armor, this is one of the best channels to check out, especially with the content he's making more recently, which brings me to that video I mentioned, this test. It is incredible. Todd brings in some experts and craftsmen who shoot historical longbow, make historically accurate medieval arrows, armor, and he brings in Tobias Capwell, Dr. Tobias Capwell and curator of the Wallace collection. He really knows his stuff, and if you watch any documentaries that are around medieval weapons and armor, Tobias Capwell most likely is in it. And so Tobias is actually in this video with Todd, sharing his expertise and looking at the tests as they happen. Because one of the big interests in medieval I guess I'm a medieval enthusiast, is how effective are arrows, and not just arrows, crossbows and stuff, against medieval armor. Some people say that a longbow can shoot through medieval armor, and some say no, it's absolutely impossible. Well, go watch Todd's video for the detailed information and results that they share. It's absolutely phenomenal. And now I want to talk about my additional thoughts based on certain things that come up in that video. It's really intriguing. And when I say intriguing, there's information that comes up that I didn't know and really made me think. For instance, one of the things that comes up when they're talking about the types of arrowheads is that they share arrows might have been case hardened. This is really interesting. Now, what is case hardening? Okay, how it works is if you have anything iron and you put it in whatever type of furnace that has a really high carbon content, and this could just be burying it in coals, even using sugar to case harden, okay? But basically what this does, it creates a layer, a surface of higher carbon steel on top of the iron. So a lot stronger than just regular iron, and they do mention they don't know if that was done. It could have been, but it's very interesting because, of course, a case-hardened arrowhead is going to be a lot stronger than the regular iron. But something that they found out is that even the case-hardened arrowheads were not able to penetrate the breastplate that they were testing against. So this is an interesting point. If the case hardening had no increased effectiveness, well, what's kind of the point? I can't really see a sharpened, case-hardened arrowhead working any better than an iron one against, say, mail or linen gambeson armor. Why? Well, you can sharpen iron as much as steel, okay? The misconception that really hard steel can get sharper than other types of metals is incorrect. It just means it'll hold that edge for longer. Now, in what circumstances would it cause to lose an edge or even a really sharp point? If it impacts something of a certain level of hardness. Now, of course, anything will cause this arrowhead to blunt on some level, but linen is one of those things that wouldn't really cause iron to blunt very significantly, and it'll be pretty easy to just resharpen as well. And flesh, neither that. Now, when it comes to mail, well, it depends, but more often than not, the tip of these arrows are actually going to hit in between the rings, not right on a ring. And even if it does hit on a ring, it's going to slip to the side and then slip through into one of those centers. And then the main force that's actually going to come into play, whether this arrow is able to force apart the rings on this mail, isn't how pointy the tip is, okay? It's the gradual taper of the arrowhead forcing the sides of the rings apart. And even if you just puncture one ring and bust it open, that's generally enough for the arrowhead and shaft to go right through the mail, and then if nothing is underneath, into the person. Generally, there'll be some type of padding associated with this mail, and an iron-tipped arrowhead would be, in my opinion, it will seem to be easily as sufficient as a case-hardened one. And so if that's the case, it would be interesting, like, is there even a point to case hardening, especially, as we found out in this test, a case-hardened arrowhead has no more likelihood of actually puncturing a proper made breastplate. Now let's go to the breastplate that they were testing against, because I found this really intriguing. I've actually developed a fairly significant interest in metallurgy based on how it is employed in constructing swords and also armor, because the type of steel that goes into making these weapons and armor is very significant to figure out how durable and effective they are. To an extent, because there is a misconception that, you know, a type of steel that's only a little bit better should destroy everything else. No, if it's only a little bit better, generally the overall performance of these metals are going to be very comparable. So the breastplate that they're testing these arrows on is based off an original that exists in a museum, and they mention that they made this breastplate out of a 0.5% carbon steel. The scales or categories that exist in regards to steel is you start with what is called wrought iron, and that is iron that has a carbon content of less than 0.08%, okay? This is under 0.1%, 0.08%. Now it's really interesting because even like as little inclusion of carbon above 0.08% is the kind of stepping over point where we consider what we have is wrought iron into what we class as mild steel. Sometimes people class mild steel as any iron that has more than 0.05% carbon in it, okay? Even that being the crossover point. And then that goes up to about 0.2 or 0.3. Sometimes even say 0.25% carbon. And that's the range of mild steel. And interesting, mild steel has some similar properties to what you would call wrought iron in terms of how soft it is. It's still stronger than regular iron. There's a reason why we have a category of mild steel. And it is very serviceable and strong for many applications. Medium carbon steels are considered around the 0.3% to 0.6% carbon. Now this is interesting. We haven't even gotten up to 1% carbon. We are under 1% steel. And even these small differences change the material properties of this iron steel so much that we put it into different categories. And then high carbon steels are generally within the ranges of 0.6 to all the way up to almost 2% carbon. And then when you go above 2% carbon in the iron, it isn't even classified as steel anymore. It's actually classified as cast iron, okay? Cast iron has a very high carbon content, which is weird because if you consider steel to be iron with carbon in it, no, there are classifications of iron that have huge amounts of carbon in it, just too much for what we consider usable steel. So why is all this really interesting? Well, we're given the exact carbon percentage of this breastplate that they're testing. 0.5%, which is a medium carbon steel. Sometimes people lump in medium carbon and high carbon together and they would consider it's a high carbon type of steel, but it's more than mild steel, okay? So it's a strong type of steel. This is important, but what I find really interesting about it, this is enough percentage of carbon in the steel for it to be tempered. But the thing is, it's not tempered. They specifically state this breastplate is not tempered. What does tempering do? I've got whole videos dedicated to this subject, so I'm not going to go into huge detail because I've done it there. So if you want to see what does the quench and tempering do to swords, check out that video. Simply put, it affects how the carbon is diffused within the iron depending on how quickly it is cooled down. If you cool it down really quickly, you can trap the carbon in a very specific type of crystalline structure called martensite, which is very hard, but it can be brittle. And tempering is the process which it removes some of the tension there to create a bit of flex, and that's how we make spring steel. All these really awesome spring steel blades, these are martensite with a proper temper on them to get the springy effect. This breastplate, it's not tempered, which means it won't have any spring to it. And they mentioned that it was basically room cooled or normalized through the normal process, which gives an even kind of cooling down process, which lets the carbon diffuse in a very natural way, not necessarily the strongest way. So what we can expect the crystalline structure of this breastplate to be would be what is called pearlite, which is where the pure iron, the ferrite, has the predominant position, and then there are strong lines of cementite, which is basically lines of very high high carbon iron where all the carbon was forced into, and they're in these kind of parallel lines to each other, which strengthens the overall internal matrix. So basically, this breastplate isn't as strong as what could have been made, but is based off an actual original, and is not as weak as it could be as well. This isn't like a mostly iron or even mild steel breastplate. It's medium carbon steel, some might even consider it high carbon, just not tempered and going through the hardening process that you could put into it. So it's very kind of middle of the line, which feels very fair for this type of test. Not the absolute best, it's not hardened steel, because it's actually, that's what you, if you hardened it and then tempered it, this is what you would say is hardened steel. It's not hardened steel, but it's not soft steel either. Right down the middle, which seems very fair. And even this middle line kind of breastplate resists it quite well. Now, having said that, there are actual examples, museum examples of medieval armor that is mild steel, in some cases mostly iron. It would be interesting to see how well those types of armor would resist against a longbow. Now, the longbow that they're using is 150 pounds. Another really interesting element that they point out is that the guy who shoots this, he can shoot a 200-pound longbow, which is crazy, but he mentions after about 5 shots, he's knackered. But when he goes down 50 pounds to the 150-pound mark, he says he can shoot that all day. Really insightful and interesting bit of information there. At 150 pound, that's crazy, okay? I've pulled back an 80-pound bow and I can draw it, right? And you feel it on your back, right? I would need to do more training to be able to get up to the 100-pound mark. Certainly within my range, I feel, but you can feel it. And this is 150 pound. Look at the thickness of this bow. It's basically a quarterstaff almost. My goodness. And it would be really interesting to see how well a low carbon steel breastplate or even just iron breastplate would do against this type of bow, because I suspect that the quality of steel in the medieval armor, and they're kind of the point of reference that they're basing this on is around, say, Agincourt, the big glorious battle of Agincourt, where that's very much seen as the longbow versus the armor kind of battle. And there was a lot of armor on that battlefield worn by the French knights. And as I was saying, I suspect that the armor quality or the steel quality in the armor probably varied quite considerably, because they didn't know how to perfectly manage the carbon content of the steel. And so I think it's very realistic to expect to see some low carbon steels in the mix there in regards to the armor. And it would be realistic to expect some higher carbon and perhaps even hardened and tempered armors amongst there. It might even be more rare than the less quality ones, but if most of them were on this even 0.5% carbon rating, the results would be very comparable to what we're seeing here in the test done by Todd and his associates. One of the things that I found really interesting in this test is that just the power that is in these arrows as they land on the target. There is a solid thunk, and there was one shot that I found really interesting where it hit kind of the bottom lip of the breastplate and then slid in underneath the breastplate, and that punctured everything underneath quite easily. And so as they point out in the video, it really seems like these French knights would have been defeated by the arrows finding the gaps, okay? The slots, like even if it was like a little bit underneath and hit the top rim of your eye slit, there's so much power behind that arrow that it would almost automatically correct and just knock right into that arrow slit, hit the guy in the eye, and they're dead. And if you just did kind of what's almost like a spray and pray approach, where they're huge volleys after volleys of arrows. Now, as to how many volleys, because Tobias points out that from the research and evidence, it looks like the English archers, they were not shooting in volleys, they were shooting front, like the arrows were just straight on, which means the knights would have had to have been in closer range. How close? Well, they show some different ranges in the test itself, and that should be enough to get a couple of shots off before the distance is actually closed. And if there's enough archers just shooting enough arrows, well, I think a number of arrows would find some of those gaps. And if not that, a solid amount of arrows would be hitting those horses. And as to how well armored those horses are, it didn't look like too much. I would feel that could be enough to stop the horses in their tracks, and if the French knights are knocked off their horses, that could stall the charge completely, and then that would give the English archers way more time to just keep laying in, and the more arrows they are able to fire, the more chances they have of hitting the gaps in this armor. And it's not only the gaps, there are also weaker points to the armor, because one of the things I love is that they point out how specifically designed the medieval armor was. It's thicker at the front and and then it's thinner along the sides, which makes perfect sense because front on, if an arrow hits the side, there's a lot more deflection happening, so there doesn't need to be as thick armor there, so it doesn't need to be as heavy, and that serves it fine. But if the knight is actually turned on the side and the arrow comes in like that, that's hitting flat on a thinner part of the armor, and it has a much higher chance of penetrating. Todd and his associates, they specifically say they're going to test these arrow shots against the thinner points of the armor, so I can't wait to see how that turns out. Another really interesting thing that we see on this test that I want to comment on is the amount of shrapnel and ricocheting that's happening after these arrows hit. So much so that injuries could actually happen from the after effects after the armor actually deflects the arrow. You see, this longbow is shooting these arrows with such tremendous power, the arrows are getting destroyed on impact, okay? They're snapping, bits are flying off, and particularly the arrowheads. The arrowheads are getting deflected at really sharp angles, and one of the things I point out, there is kind of like a funnel line on the breastplate that is helping deflect the arrows off to the side once they hit, which really shows in a very real, practical, full-on sense why that design element is even put on the breastplate in the first place. Because breastplates that don't have that small line of deflection, so many of these arrow shots will be getting deflected up, and if there's nothing protecting their chin, they could get a arrow thing right in the underneath the chin jawline. And perhaps that's actually what happened in Agincourt in some instances, where these arrows are hitting, splinters are flying off, and the arrowheads are flying off at these different angles, which could actually get underneath the armor in certain places, causing injury like that. That's a very significant thing to consider. They point out that these arrows could go through other parts of the armor, like the back of the legs and such, where there's not solid plates and the thinner plates, like I mentioned before, so additional tests would be really intriguing to see. And the last thing that I want to point out, it was just really interesting, it seems like Gambesson is better at resisting arrows than mail. With mail, especially if you're shooting with a bodkin type arrowhead, which is a really thin, narrow arrowhead, as soon as you slip in between those rings, there's very little force resisting it. But with Gambesson, you have several layers of linen trying to resist that force. Now, it's not perfect, and not in every circumstance would it resist, but the type of arrowhead would play a major role in how effective this armor is resisting. For instance, a broadhead. Broadheads are pretty darn pathetic at trying to go through mail, but the types of heads that they're using in this test, much, much better. Todd even points out in his video where he goes through the different arrowheads, I believe, it might have been in a different video, but he basically says if there's any type of arrowhead that has a chance of punching through armor, it's not one that's circular, it's one that actually has square kind of angled corners, shaped into flat sides, because that when the arrow actually hits, instead of trying to stretch out the armor in a uniform circle, it's actually got points of focus where that force is being concentrated on the edges of this square type arrowhead, which actually helps peel back the armor a bit like a can opener instead of just stretching it all out uniformly. But even these types of arrowheads, which they are using in the tests, don't go through the armor. But they would do a lot better going through mail, which is why mail looks to be less effective than Gambesson. And another test that they did in this test is that they test the armor with a type of linen textile armor on top of it called a jupon. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's depicted in medieval artwork and plays a major role in helping protect the knight, the guy wearing the armor, from the shrapnel and deflecting arrowheads, because this jupon helps trap the arrowhead. It goes through it pretty solidly and easily, but once it hits the armor and then starts to deflect, it gets caught in on the linen underneath. So that's a really interesting extra defensive element that metal plate armor did have in the medieval period, and we get to see the functional reason why it might have been there. So a very practical reason why linen textile armor was actually laid on top of metal armor. Very cool stuff. So I'm just basically fanboying over this whole video because it was so interesting on so many levels. I loved it, and Todd is producing some of the best content we have here in our community, so please go watch his video. I want to give it more attention. Go subscribe to him, and of course I just wanted to nerd out with you like some of these awesome things that they brought up and some of my own additional thoughts on the matter. So this is me basically doing a running commentary on the test, sharing, oh, this is so cool, this is additional thoughts and everything. Yeah, it was so much fun. Excellent video. Please go check out Todd's stuff, and of course stick around for my next video, which I hope to see you there, and until that time, farewell.